Good evening. Bad Lieutenant, a film by Abel Ferrara, is an uncomfortable and controversial movie that pushes at, and some would say oversteps, the boundaries of good taste. When the film was first screened here in 1993, it was shown uncut. Indeed, the head film censor, James Furman, praised it as a study in Catholic redemption. But when it came to be released on video, it was a different story. The Jamie Bulger trial had heightened fears about the effects of video violence. The British Board of Film Classification, which under James Furman has jurisdiction over both films and video, refused to issue a certificate. It wasn't banned, but neither was it given a video release, and so the tape gathered dust on the shelves. The BBFC were waiting for Parliament to make up its mind on how to deal with the concerns about video violence. Finally, at the end of last year, a specific video amendment to the Criminal Justice Act became law. Bad Lieutenant was finally released on video earlier today, but there are major cuts in crucial scenes. So should viewers be prevented from seeing things in their own living rooms, which they can see in public cinemas? The film critic Mark Kermode believes they shouldn't. The Late Show asked him to review the case of Bad Lieutenant. Inevitably, his report contains material some viewers may find disturbing.
When Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers was temporarily banned from British cinemas last year, the story made national headlines, because in Britain, the outlawing of a mainstream movie is a rare event. On video, however, the story is very different. Here, films are regularly cut or banned, with little attention being paid to their fate by the press or public. This is the story of one movie's journey from the big screen to the small screen and the cuts it endured en route. A year ago, Britain was in the grip of a moral panic sparked off by the murder of Jamie Bulger, which the judge in the case linked to violent videos. The Sun said, "Burn your video nasty," and MPs on both sides of the House clamoured for legal reform, which finally arrived at the end of last year in the shape of the Criminal Justice Act. Contained within this act are stringent new regulations regarding the censorship of video, and the first video to suffer and be cut heavily under the new restrictions is Abel Ferrara's Bad Lieutenant.
Put your shades on to feel cool, but it's still the law. Gotta put your shades on so you can feel cool.
A gritty tale of an amoral New York policeman's physical degradation and eventual spiritual redemption, Bad Lieutenant opened uncut in cinemas in early '93 with an 18 certificate. Typically of a film by Abel Ferrara, creator of the notorious Driller Killer, it deals with violence, corruption and drugs.
She's gonna kill you, man.
The fuck are you, a drug counselor? A drug dealer? You have to do your own product. What kind of fucking businessman are you?
When the BBFC first viewed Bad Lieutenant for video, they were largely positive. The chief censor, James Furman, had seen the film as a study of one man's journey from damnation to salvation. Perhaps the video could be passed uncut. But then, the furore surrounding the Bulger case erupted and the censors were forced to take evasive action.
Get back! Police activity!
With its reputation as the most censorious country in Europe, Britain now faced calls for even tighter restrictions on video, calls which at least temporarily kept films such as Michael Winner's Dirty Weekend, the horror movie Beyond Bedlam, Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs and Bad Lieutenant out of the video stores.
Reservoir Dogs and The Bad Lieutenant were passed uncut for a video certificate by the BBFC examiners, but then that was withdrawn at the last minute by the chief censor, James Furman, because he had to be seen to be doing something, which he duly did.
What happened on this is the first two examiners did think it could be passed, were not that pro the film, but did think it could be passed. Then the Bulger killing happened, all the debate happened, and these government ministers made their speeches about screen violence and the accessibility of violent videos to the young, and possibly the young offenders. And we said, no, wait a minute, let's hold on.
As a result, all potentially contentious titles were consigned to video limbo, while MPs argued the case for heavier censorship. Ever since the introduction over a decade ago of the Video Recordings Act, the BBFC has cut videos with the specific problems of home viewing in mind. The popular horror movie The Evil Dead was cut by 65 seconds for its video release, while the critically acclaimed Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer had key scenes radically re-edited for the VCR. MPs may have felt that this was a new problem, but Chief Censor James Furman had always distinguished between the viewing of contentious material at home rather than in the cinema.
The big difference, of course, is that cinema has a gatekeeper at the box office, and therefore you can control, to a certain extent anyway, audience age. There's also the possibility that video will be viewed in a different way. In the cinema, you start at the beginning of the film and you go through, as the filmmaker made it, in his time, to the end of the film. You get the whole context, which may have justified leaving a scene uncut. Whereas on video, even those who are interested at the beginning of the film may get bored and begin skipping. Or, because it's in the home, it may be viewed by people with quite an obsessional approach to certain kinds of material who view certain scenes over and over and over again because they are particularly fixated on certain kinds of experience.
MPs now agreed on an amendment to the existing legislation which ordered the BBFC to pay special attention to a video's depiction of crime, drugs, violence, horrific behaviour and sexual activity. Although these areas had always been considered by the BBFC, the new laws demanded extra vigilance, reducing the censor's power of discretion. Any prospects of Bad Lieutenant being passed uncut on video now evaporated, although James Furman insists that cuts were always likely due to its treatment of drugs and sexual violence.
In 1980-something, a nun was raped by two men in New York City. All right? This was an event. This was a real thing. I didn't even dream this up, right? We made a movie that was somehow inspired, for lack of a better term, by this event. How I, being brought up Catholic, and why I even remembered this event. There's a million news stories. Why do I even remember that happened? What made me want to make a film about that? It's all inherent in that scene.
2 shots were cut from this scene, one showing the forced removal of the nun's underwear, another a thrust of the rapist's buttocks.
Let me make it very clear, we have not made the rape scene less exciting by those 2 cuts. We did not set out to do that. What we set out to do was to make it less sexually exciting, and by taking out the shot of her pubic hair revealed and of his bum thrusting into her, those are 2 very sexually anatomical shots which change the nature of the scene. We tried to keep it general.
I don't think the cutting of those 2 specific pieces out of that scene will change anything substantially, because the context is everything. The context is excitement, the thrill. As a scene hits you, there is red light, there is funky music, and there is focus on a very voluptuous, young, beautiful nun. Why isn't she small, frumpy, ugly, hairy?
It's in a completely different style from the rest of the film. It's not seen from Harvey Keitel's point of view. It doesn't involve him in the way that the rest of the film does. It's also shot in a very rapidly edited MTV style with a slamming soundtrack in the background that really gives it a grungy and nasty feel. And I think that the scene as a whole, in both the theatrical version and in the video version, is quite problematic. And I don't think the removal of those 2 short shots has actually substantially altered the problems that already exist.
Startlingly, at the last moment, the video distributors replaced the rock soundtrack with organ music. This change, credited to contractual complications, radically affects the scene.
My work isn't for 5-year-olds, okay? So therefore, for those who see it, no one should be sitting there recutting my movie. If I was the government, if I had a problem with the Bad Lieutenant, then you should just ban the Bad Lieutenant.
Further problems were raised by a scene in which the lieutenant and his girlfriend shoot up heroin. Here, the censors tried to preserve the narrative, but cut explicit injection shots.
It goes on in great, great detail. So if you want to know how to fix heroin, you certainly can find out from this. All of this, everything to do with him and her coming over to him is in. The only thing that we cut out here was, again, the length of time that the process is on the screen. All the beginning is in. But once she begins injecting, you watch his face, it settles into a position of being almost zonked out and stops reacting. And the only thing that's interesting on the screen is what's happening in the syringe. It's filling up, it's pumping the blood back into him. As she injects him, you hardly see the needle because her hand is masking it. And this is where we dissolve to 31 seconds later. And as her hand goes up, that's where we came back into it. And from now on, his face is interesting. You watch his face, and he's going into oblivion, which is what he wants. So that's of quite a lot of importance from a character point of view, which we didn't want to lose. We could have simply cut away from the scene earlier on, but you'd never have known quite so specifically why he is a heroin addict.
I think that clearly on video, the instructional quality of the scene is particularly problematic. You can watch it, re-watch it, rewind it, watch it on slow motion, go through it frame by frame, and it is a virtual how-to manual in terms of heroin injecting.
As an addictions counsellor, and I've written a book on addiction, there is definitely a sort of sexy hit in watching somebody shoot up. It's almost like a penetration when you see the needle going in. And a lot of addicts are really excited by that. And in a sense, it is a step-by-step account of how to do it. But there's many other places that you can find out about that, and you can see it on other films, and you can learn if you're around drugs anyway. So to just snip out a scene, I don't think necessarily does anything. And if you're looking at the film as a whole, I don't think it really makes any difference.
So they don't want to show anyone shooting up, as if that reality doesn't exist. I mean, so that's the point. So we take that out of that. That means it's not there in the world. People don't abuse drugs, in theory. I mean, if that's what the point of that scene was, that this guy is into, abuse of his body, right? And the metaphor of drug abuse.
Last year, the British Film Institute showed Bad Lieutenant to a range of audiences around the country to stimulate discussion about film and video censorship. Audiences were asked which, if any, of the film scenes they found offensive.
When the Censorship Roadshow audience spoke, and they were very noisy and very vociferous, they spoke mostly about violence, and particularly about violence against women. I think at no venue that I can remember was the issue of drug and drug abuse raised. So the fact that the BBFC has spent so long agonising about this drug scene in Bad Lieutenant strikes me as one of those signs that they're simply out of kilter with the anxieties that the audience feels.
Drug taking is a particular bugbear of the chief censor, James Furman. He's applied it particularly to Warhol films. But for the future, it means that definitely the method, the process of drug taking will be affected in future films. It becomes very difficult because if you have a character such as the Bad Lieutenant, who is corrupt, who's a dope head, who is extorting from various characters, prostituting himself, then you're making a film about such a character. How do you do this in the future without portraying his corruption?
Many had argued that one solution would be to provide explicit warnings on the packaging about a video's theme and content. Bad Lieutenant carries the BBFC's newly developed consumer advice grid, but this has been used as well as, not instead of, cuts.
No! It's a funny old world, isn't it?
All this means that increasingly what you get on video is a cut-down version of the original film. The British horror movie Beyond Bedlam had cuts made from 2 scenes for its video release, while Reservoir Dogs has been effectively banned on video for over a year. And the chances of Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers, which has now been passed uncut for cinemas, receiving such lenient treatment on video seem non-existent. The role of the film and video critic has now taken on an important new dimension.
I think the quite natural assumption when a film comes out on video is that it is the same film that you saw at the cinema or thought about seeing at the cinema but didn't get around to seeing. That is no longer true. The essence of the problem is that somebody has to provide the information about the fact that this video is not the same entity. It is now substantially different in some cases, it has been cut, and we are, as critics, the only source of that information.
First of all, my films are made for adults, quote-unquote adults, whatever the definition of an adult is in this day and age. And they're not meant for young children, okay? The fact is, if a 10-year-old is going around watching a movie like that, that says more about the parent than it does about me and my filmmaking, you know?
Living under the present system of film censorship in Britain is rather like a bad dream. It's like being told that you're 12 years old, that you say to yourself, well, no, I'm not. I'm an adult. I should be able to see what I'm can see I'm a responsible person. But the bad dream goes on. We're children in the eyes of the censor.
I think certainly in the last year we have been very, very cautious while we waited to see the framework we'd be working on. But you must remember, it's Parliament who laid this down. It's both sides of Parliament. And it's my impression that if the government changes, we're not going to get a massively different policy. It is the view of most parliamentarians today that violence in the media does need controlling.
Mark Kermode reporting.